He has a physical genealogy through David because we know only the Messiah could come through David's line. He was also part of Israel according to the flesh, Romans 9:5. We read these words. Theirs are the patriarchs, and from them is traced the human ancestry of Christ, who is God over all, forever praised. Amen. We see this transition. Earlier we talk about the brothers of Israel, the people of Israel. And so he was born according to the flesh of the people of Israel. He was also born of a woman, Galatians 4:4. But when the time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive the full rights as sons. So he's born of a woman, again his humanity, under the law. And he also speaks about James as the Lord's brother, Galatians 1:19. We're right there, so just back up a few chapters. We read these words. I saw none other of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. As I said, Jesus had at least 6 siblings in his family if we look at various scriptures together. So Paul is now speaking of his humanity. So we're now looking at the book of Hebrews. And some would say, well, the Apostle Paul wrote that. It should be Pauline, but his name is not there. It's very different. Now, some of you would probably battle this out. I'll let you figure that out. But Hebrews does take a different approach in discussing the humanity and deity of Christ than the other Pauline epistles. So in Hebrews chapter, let's look at some of these verses in Hebrews. Let's take our Bible and turn there. In Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9, we read these words. But we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death. So by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. In chapter 2, verse 14, we read, since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in the humanity. He shares flesh and blood with us. Subject to temptation, 2:18. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. And then he also prayed with loud cries and tears. I know there are people of liturgical churches and some people that are very reserved that say, how could this be our Jesus, this little meek and mild Jesus? But this verse tells us of the emotion of Jesus in his prayer life. In verse 7 it says of Hebrews 5, during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears. Is that the Jesus you know? Loud cries and tears. Again, sharing our humanity. He also learned obedience through suffering. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10. Which says, in bringing many sons to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the author of their salvation perfect through suffering. So his suffering was perfected through that. He also experienced godly fear. Hebrews 5, verse 7, which we just read. During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. All right? There's this godly fear he received. And he knew that death was part of his mission. He knew he came to die. Romans 2, or that is Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9, which says, but we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. And then verse 14 says, since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity so that by his death he might destroy him who holds the power of death. Death was part of the mission of Jesus. And of course, only human beings die. God does not die. Now, in his life as recorded in the Gospels, we're looking now at the sinfulness of man. We looked at his humanity. So we're saying Jesus Christ is fully human, fully God. The only difference with his humanity is there is no sin. So let's look at this to understand Jesus is sinless. Now, although he was totally a man of transparency and integrity, fully what you see is him. First, to understand he never confessed any sin. The Apostle Paul this great apostle talks about this battle between the flesh and the spirit. The other writers talk about, again, the battle of sinful man, that all have sin. Even the Apostle John, the beloved, said, if we say we have no sin, we make God a liar and his truth is not in him. So, but not in Jesus' case. Never confess any sin. He had complete victory in his temptation. He overcame that. And although he was accused of breaking the law, he never was accused of moral sin. Of course, law, not the Old Testament law, but these added laws that were given by the Jewish community. Some claim Jesus' harshness with scribes and Pharisees demonstrated that he was not without sin. He said, woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites. But it just shows the true heart and nature of God toward those the religious who oppose God. And then Jesus always claimed he was doing the will of God. Now, we can't do that. Our pastor this last Sunday said, how many of you are 100% totally obedient to God? Raise your hand. Now, I want to be obedient to God. I try to hear the voice of God. I try to walk in the way of God. I want to serve God with my whole heart, but I could not put my hand up. I am not 100% totally obedient to God. Now, no one else did in the congregation either. But Jesus claimed to always be doing the will of God. I can't say that. No other human. I miss it. Everyone does. This demonstrates Jesus' sinlessness. Look at John chapter 6, verse 38. John 6, 38. Which says, for I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but to do the will of him who sent me. All right, Jesus said, I've come to do the will. Well, I have come too, but I can't say I've always done the will of God. Now, just as his life, as recorded in the Gospels, talks about that he's sinless, also the New Testament writers do the same thing. John the Apostle in 1 John 3:5 says, in him there's no sin. Paul said in 2 Corinthians 5:21, he knew no sin. And the writer of the Hebrew said, he is tempted in every way just as we are, yet without sin. And Peter said he committed no sin, 1 Peter 2:22. So Jesus lived a life of sinlessness as demonstrated in the Gospels. It's confirmed by the New Testament writers. There was no sin in him. He did no sin. He knew no sin. He was tempted without sin. He committed no sin. We see very clearly that Jesus is sinless. Now, our next lesson, we're going to look at titles given to Jesus Christ to demonstrate his deity. We've discussed his humanity, yet his humanity with sinlessness. We'll take up in our next session discussing titles that are given him that demonstrate the deity of Jesus Christ.